Hello, BookTube. The great Victorian novelist Anthony Trollope is famous for books in series. He wrote two long series, the Barsetshire series and the Palliser series. And we spent a great deal of time, had a great deal of fun reading through the Palliser novels last year on this channel. And we will get to the other series, the more famous series, in good time. But for 2020, I had the idea that we would go to some of the standalone novels that Trollope wrote. The ones that aren't part of a series and that tend to just blur into indistinguishability to people who aren't familiar with Trollope. I thought that for the course of 2020 we would consort with lonely Trollops, and that's what we're doing. We're continuing on for the month of April to read Mr. Scarborough's Family, the 1883 novel of Anthony Trollope, the last really serious novel that he wrote, the last one that has any kind of heft on its bones. The story of the eponymous Mr. Scarborough, a sick, ailing, and cantankerous old man who is in possession of a wealthy estate and does not want to be told by the law how he can dispose of it. He wants to determine how he will dispose of it himself. He has two sons, Montjoy and Augustus. And Montjoy is a spendthrift and a gambling addict. A blowhard and incapable of saving money, as Mr. Scarborough says in the chapters that we're reading today. His gambling is a barrel without a bottom. And the younger son, Augustus, is a lawyer, and he is outwardly more respectable, but it doesn't take long in the course of this book for us to realize, and to have confirmed in the opinion of Mr. Scarborough, the boy's own father, that he's oily, false, cold. Mr. Scarborough says early on in the book that he actually prefers Montjoy to Augustus, and it's not hard for readers to prefer Montjoy either, as little as we get of him. The problem is that Mr. Scarborough's estate is entailed on Montjoy as the eldest son, and that is disaster, as Mr. Scarborough knows perfectly well. Montjoy will gamble the whole estate away. There'll be nothing left. It will all go to creditors. So it's not just that the estate will be encumbered with debt, it's that there won't be any estate. The creditors will own the land, they'll own the house, they'll own the pottery works that are making him a wealthy person. And Mr. Scarborough can't break the entail because the law says that he can't, and that bothers him. And fortunately, he has the means at his disposal. He reveals to his lawyer, Mr. Gray, and to the world that his son Montjoy is illegitimate, that he never was the heir to Tretton Park, the property that is Mr. Scarborough's to bequeath, that he never was the heir because he wasn't legitimate, and therefore all of the debts that he has taken out with all of the moneylenders in London, based on the fact that he's going to inherit Tretton Park, are all void, and those moneylenders are incensed. They're enraged that a trick has been played on them. They don't believe it. They don't believe Mr. Scarborough, and for a long time, Mr. Scarborough's lawyer, Mr. Gray, doesn't believe him either. But Mr. Scarborough has all the documentation to prove that it's Augustus who is actually heir to Tretton Park, and that Montjoy is not. So the debts don't matter. Mr. Scarborough has no intention of paying them, and Montjoy is reduced to being nobody, to being nobody. His long-standing informal engagement to his first cousin is null and void. And Augustus, his brother, is oily enough to think, well, if I'm going to inherit the property now, maybe it's probably right that I inherit her as well. It's just the kind of oily, horrible thing that we've come to expect from the second son. And the Florence Montjoy is also in love. She's in love with a young simp, the kind of young simp that Trollope is really good at portraying, named Harry Ainsley. And it just so happens that Montjoy knows that. He has a sense of that. And right after he has been disinherited, when he has been drinking, he and Harry Ainsley meet each other at 2 in the morning in a by-street of London with no one anywhere around, and exchange blows. And Harry Ainsley is unscathed, and he leaves Montjoy sprawled on the ground, but apparently alive, and part ways. And after that, Montjoy disappears. And naturally, word starts to percolate out, mainly because Harry Ainsley keeps bringing up the subject. He is terrible at being discreet. If he hadn't said anything, done anything, no one would have associated him with the crime, with the disappearance at all. But because he is inquiring everywhere at Scotland Yard, people start to draw connections between the two and wonder if maybe he had something to do with it. And lots of people do. Mr. Scarborough, for instance, wants to know what happened to his eldest son, and wants to know if maybe this Harry Ainsley person who knows the family knows about it. And Augustus has Harry Ainsley for dinner and asks him questions. When did you last see Montjoy? And in the course of the book as we've read so far, we're reading the next 16 chapters today. In the course of the book as we read so far, it is obvious that Augustus, that Harry Montjoy, that Montjoy, when he recovered his wits, went to his brother, and that his brother knew when he was questioning Harry Ainsley about when's the last time you saw him. He knew perfectly well all the details. He doesn't tell his father. He doesn't tell anyone. But Scotland Yard wants to know what the connection is between Harry Ainsley and the disappearance of Montjoy. And Mr. Scarborough wants to know. And in the course of the chapters that we're reading today, one other person also wants to know, and that is Harry Ainsley's benefactor, who is a squire and who has long since assured Harry that he need not go into a profession because he's going to inherit the squire's entire estate and wealth. When word reaches that squire that Harry Ainsley is not only was the last person to see Montjoy alive, but also has lied about it, then in the chapters that we're reading today, in a kind of a weak subplot, he basically threatens to disinherit the young man. And I'm not sure that the extent of the pages that are devoted to that, and also to his benefactor trying to find a wife, I'm not sure that the pages devoted to that are, I mean, they're entertaining. Everything that Trollope writes is entertaining, but I'm not sure that they have any kind of weight. I'm not sure that in a perfect world of reorganizing this book, I would have kept them. As a subplot, I think it's kind of weak. I'll be interested to know if you think the same thing. Were you after we've been told? I mean, we're told the first time that we meet Harry that he's kind of wishy-washy, that he's not all that interesting, not all that vibrant, not all that heroic. I think an author who goes out of his way at the beginning of events to tell you that has a bit of nerve than hanging a whole subplot on such a character. But the main things that we're dealing with in the chapters that we're reading today are more interior than that. The thread that runs through these 16 chapters is far more interior. Things do happen, including a signature Trollope fox hunting scene. But I think the main things here are quieter in these chapters, quieter and more internal. We have a long, wonderful chapter where Mr. Scarborough reflects on himself, both inwardly and to his young caregiver. And we also have, right at the beginning of the chapters that we're reading today, a wonderful moment, a wonderful description of Mr. Scarborough's lawyer's daughter, Dolly, who I mentioned last time as being a weird, strange character, not probably someone that you could build a book around. And Trollope, I don't think he had perfect instincts for storytelling, so I don't think he would ever have thought to build a book around Dolly Gray. But I read to you a passage where he describes her, and it's clear, the more you read Trollope, the more you realize that a description of the type that we read about her is pure praise. It doesn't get any higher than that from Trollope. And right after that description, we get a little glimpse of what her life is like with her father. I wanted to read you that to give you a better idea of why I like this character so much. Because we are told right away in the chapters that we're reading today that Mr. Gray is indiscreet. Because he cannot leave his work at work. He brings his work home. He discusses the details of his cases with his daughter. And not just cursorily. He needs her. I want to read you this here. He was a man who could not possibly be induced to leave his business behind him at his office. It made the chief subject of conversation when he was at home. He would even call Dolly into his bedroom late at night, bringing her out of bed for the occasion to discuss with her some point of legal strategy, of legal but still honest strategy which had just occurred to him. Maybe he had not quite seen his way as to the honesty and wanted Dolly's opinion on the subject. Dolly would come in her dressing gown and, sitting on his bed, would discuss the matter with him as advocate against the devil. Sometimes she would be convinced, more frequently she would hold her own. But the points which were discussed in that way, and the strength of argumentation which was used on either side, would have surprised the clients and the partner and the clerks and the eloquent barrister who was occasionally employed to support this side or other. The eloquent barrister, or it might be the client himself, startled sometimes at the amount of enthusiasm which Mr. Gray would throw into his argument, would little dream that the very words that had come from the young lady that in her dressing gown. To tell the truth, Miss Gray thoroughly liked these discussions, whether held on the lawn or in the dining room armchairs or during the silent hours of the night. They formed indeed the very salt of her life. She felt herself to be the conscience of the law firm. Her father was the reason, and the partner, in her own phraseology, was the devil. For it must be understood that Dolly Gray had a spice of fun about her, of which her father had the full advantage. She would not have called her father's partner the devil to any other ear but her father's, but that her father understood also the spirit in which the sobriquet had been applied. He did not think that his partner was worse than any other man, nor did he think that his daughter so thought. The partner, whose name was Barry, was a man of average honesty who would occasionally be surprised at the searching justness with which Mr. Gray would look into a matter after it had already been debated for a day or two in the office. But Mr. Barry, though he had the pleasure of Miss Gray's acquaintance, had no idea of the nature of the duties which she performed in the firm. I remember the first time I read that, and every time I go back to this book, I'm struck by it again. That scene that you picture in your mind of him. We see it. It gets dramatized for us a little later in these chapters, where he's after the long day and after they've had dinner and after they've talked, after they've retired to bed, he will go down the hall, knock on her door, ask him to come join her, and then scamper back to his room under the covers of the bed, and she will put on her dressing gown and go down and sit on his bed, and they will talk late into the night about the details of his case. And that description makes it clear that they're not just talking about trivialities of law, that he gets a lot of his moral backbone from her, and that she loves it. That little moment, that little picture of a moment where he goes to her room as a ritual, knocks on her door, goes back to his own room late at night, and they just quietly sit there talking about the right and wrong of whatever case is before him. That is just amazing. That is just that quiet, totally human moment is just so amazing. I love it. I absolutely love it, it makes me a little bit happy, but also a little bit ambiguous that Dolly Gray gets her own tiny little plot as the book goes on. I wish that she didn't. That she doesn't need one. Not everybody needs a plot. To a novelist, every problem, it's like a man with a hammer. Every problem is a nail. And to a novelist, every character who's slightly interesting needs a book. That isn't true. That isn't true. But I wanted to get to. There's a great chapter here where Mr. Gray goes to Tretton Park and has to listen to a horrible, it's a fantastically done scene, a horrible, cutting three-way conversation between him and Augustus and Mr. Scarborough about the nature of the debts on the property and whether or not Montjoy should be saved and whether or not his debts should be paid and all the I wish I could do the scene justice reading it, but I'd need two other readers to do that. But it is incredible, and it shows what critics have always said about this book, which they don't say about, for instance, The Landleaguers or An Old Man's Love. Which they don't always say about any of the very last works that Trollope did. Those critics say that scenes like that are Trollope in absolutely perfect form, and I agree. But Mr. Gray is, the more he learns, the more appalled he is by this family. And we get a little bit of his summary of them, needless to say, confessed to his daughter. He says, the father has been a great knave. He has set the laws of his country at defiance and should be punished most severely. And Montjoy Scarborough has proved himself to be unfit to have any money in his hands. A man so reckless is little better than a lunatic. But compared with Augustus, they are both estimable, amiable men. The father has ideas of philanthropy, and Montjoy is simply mad. But Augustus is as dishonest as either of them and as odious all around. Then he at length explained to her what he had learned and all that he had been advised, and at last went to bed, combating Dolly's idea that the Scarboroughs ought to be thrown over altogether, because she has a very severe Old Testament sense of justice and says, if none of these people are dealing honorably with you, so dump them all. And he can't bring himself to do that. But that moment shows that there are no illusions here. No one has any illusions about each other. None of the men do in this book. They know exactly what they're dealing with, and I think so does Florence Mountjoy when her mother takes her to Brussels to get her away from Harry Annesley, and in Brussels, an attaché at the diplomatic legation, a young man pitches woo to her, and I think it's pretty clear in those bits of those chapters that she sees both him and Harry Annesley for more or less exactly what they are. This is a novel without much in the way of illusions, except among the foolish. The foolish characters in this book and in all Trollope books maintain their illusions against considerable odds. Considerable. But those are the chapters that we're reading today. I'm wondering what you're making of this as you go along. I myself think that by this point, I think Trollope knew that he had an absolute crackerjack plot here. And when he knew that, when he wasn't what he referred to as heavy going, when he had a crackerjack plot, it filled him with joy. Even now, even when he was writing this book and had, kidney stones and arthritis and worries about his own financial future and the financial future of his family, even so, when he had a great fox running to hounds like this, I think it made him happy. And I think that happiness fills this book. And I'm wondering if you're feeling that. I've been very, very enheartened in the last 2 weeks at how many of you have said, boy, oh boy, I liked Trollope's prose before. I liked that world that he makes, that kind of warm world, that narrative voice that is just a wonderful old friend telling you a great story that he means to intrigue you and arouse your passions but not upset you. A lot of you said you missed that Trollope in The Way We Live Now, and a lot of you in the last few weeks have been saying, boy, oh boy, that Trollope is here in spades, and I liked it before, but in 2020, nowadays, I had no idea how much I needed that. I'm so grateful. And that is just wonderful to hear, because that is this author's magic. And it's great to hear that he hasn't lost it. And I think this book is full of that magic. In the little human details and also in the larger plot, because the larger plot is not done. It is not done. Don't you believe it? So we're going to stop there for now, and we're going to move on. Let's see here. I always lose my place in my chapters. We're going to move on next time to, let's see here, all the way to the chapter, let's see here. Mr. Prosper changes his mind. We'll go all the way to the chapter Mr. Prosper changes his mind. So that's should be roughly another 16 chapters, and that'll put us within striking distance of the end. So I want to hear all about it. If you're reading this book, if you're reading along, I want to hear all about it, hear what you think, and we will reconvene next Sunday. We'll talk more about Trollope. So I will wrap this up for now, and I'll see you then. Thank you, Book 2.